Right, good afternoon everyone. I'm blown away by the quality of the projects we've just seen from the students actually. I don't know why I'm blown away because they're always really good. And I'm also very impressed that people would give up their Saturdays to come and do more work. So congratulations. I'm going to put some stuff up here for you all to look at. Because before I start talking about behaviour in antimicrobial resistance, I'm going to talk a little bit about behaviour, full stop. Kopparberg. No, you can't see it very well from here. This one's a Monster energy drink. Of course, everyone recognises this one. For the older people amongst us, it's a Sauvignon. And some cigarettes. Okay, so what I want you to do is ask yourself, do any of those things draw your attention? Now I know that they're quite far away from you, and it would be better if they were closer for some reasons. But what I want is a show of hands. Does anyone feel drawn? Does anyone feel stimulated by the Maltesers? Okay. Okay. The chocolate's always the main one. What about the Monster energy drink? Yeah? That always works for students, but never for qualified staff. The Kopparberg, again, good for students. The Sauvignon Blanc, yeah? Some people, just all of them. You guys in the middle, all of it. And what about the cigarettes? Few of us, less likely to admit that one in public. But yeah, still a few people there. So what I want you to do is every time you notice one of these things, every time it comes to your mind, every time you notice one, I want you to make a little tally, a little stroke on the thing in front of you. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute because that helps us understand some stuff about behaviour. So, what I now want you to do, given that it's halfway through the afternoon, is I want you to stand up if you've ever done any of these health risky behaviours. So I want you to stand up if you've ever smoked, if you've drank more than the recommended units of alcohol, either in a night or in a week, if you've travelled in a car without a seatbelt, if you've taken drugs, recreational drugs, not ones from a pharmacy, if you've ever done any climbing, any extreme sports, if you've ever crossed a very busy road, not at the traffic lights. So there's always one or two people still seated at this point. Which is remarkable. So stay standing, okay? But I want you to sit down if, before you did that thing, you knew that there was a risk to your health. You knew that it was a risky thing, that it wasn't good for your health. Are you the extreme sports people? There's always one or two extreme sports people. It is risky, by the way. Just, sorry to break that to you. But yeah, there's always one or two. But mainly, you can sit down again now. Thank you. Mainly, what we know is that knowledge doesn't change behaviour. Okay? There are some things that we need to know in order to begin to change our behaviour, but it's often not sufficient. And we know that, we know it from this, we all know it quite deeply. However, when we start to talk about things like taking antibiotics, prescribing antibiotics, dispensing antibiotics, what we want to do, our sort of common sense approach, is to give people information. Okay? We want to tell them stuff about why and how and what and where. And by and large, it's ineffective. So it might get you a little bit of the way forward, but it probably won't get you a lot of the way forward. And all of us are evidence of that. Okay. So can we just put to one side for a minute the idea that we can change people's behaviour by telling them things? And then think about what else might influence our behaviour. Okay, so shout out if you know something that might influence whether or not you'll do something. Reward, somebody said over here, yep. You'll have to shout really loud because I'm quite hard of hearing. Experience, tell me a bit more about that one.
So if you've experienced something, you're more likely not to do it again or you do it again depending on if it is a good or bad experience.
Okay, so quite like the reward thing down here. So if you've had a positive experience of doing it before, you're likely to do it again. If you've had a negative experience, you're not likely to do it again. Okay, yeah, anything else? Sorry? Peer pressure, brilliant. Who said that one? Put your hand up. Fantastic. Sort of social pressure to do things or to not do things, to engage in a certain thing. Yeah, brilliant. Consequences. So I think that links quite nicely to reward and a previous experience, but also imagined consequences as well. So what you think might be the consequences, yeah?
Cost.
Sorry?
Cost.
Cost, brilliant. Cost, time, any other kind of resource, equipment, those kind of things might really influence as well. I think you've covered all of them, apart from one actually. So, I know I've been fascinating for the last 10 minutes, but have any of you got any marks on your tally chart for any of the things? Which one and how many?
I only half a dozen for the wine.
Just for the wine? Okay, good. And how many?
Just half a dozen.
Just one tally. Oh, six tallies. Blimey. 6 tallies for the wine. Not as interesting as I thought it was. Yeah, at the back. The Maltesers. How many? 5 for the Maltesers. Any advance on 5 for the Maltesers? Yeah? 5 as well. 6. There's a 6 for the Maltesers down here. Brilliant. Okay. So what none of us said is what this is, which is impulse. Okay? I'm going to come back and talk to you about the origins and the importance of impulse in behaviour in a minute. But first of all, we're going to just quickly show you this. Forgive me, because some health professional students might have seen this kind of thing before, but basically we can break down the kind of things that cause behaviour, that influence behaviour, into 3 categories. There's capability, which is the knowledge and skill stuff. Okay, we know that influences, but we know it's only one bit of it. There's the opportunity, which is the time, resource, other people, equipment, but it's also social opportunity. So we tend not to do things that we haven't been given the sort of social ability to do. I once illustrated this by asking somebody to take their clothes off, but unfortunately they did stand up and start to take their clothes off. So I've revised my opinion of whether or not social opportunity stops people taking their clothes off. But a thing that does stop us taking our clothes off, most of us, is the social opportunity, because we know that that's not acceptable. And then motivation is a really complicated thing because it's reflective. So it is about, do I think it's okay? Do I think it's easy? Is it going to have a good consequence? All those kind of reflective things that you're sort of weighing up the pros and cons. But it's also impulsive. It's also automatic. It's, has somebody made me think of it? Have I had a strong sensation, an impulse arise in me because of it? Am I in the habit of doing it? Okay. And so we can be really, really motivated. We can understand everything. We can really believe in the consequences. We can really be passionate about doing something, and then in the moment, we just stop doing it. We just don't do it, or we just do the thing that we're trying to stop. Because at that time, at that moment, our automatic motivation has a fight with our reflective motivation. Okay, and one of the best ways of understanding this is called the prime theory, where you actually think about motivation in reflective and automatic. And basically, when you're reflective, you make plans. So I'm going to do this thing differently. I'm not going to prescribe for these people. I am going to check this thing before I do a review prescription, etc., etc. And you have a lot of beliefs about why you should do that. And then when you're in the moment, there are competing things that get in your way. So you maybe have counter impulses. You've got some negative thing that's happening. Maybe you don't have the emotional space, the cognitive space to draw on that reflective, and you're pushed in a sort of pinball type way. You're sort of shepherded down a particular route that goes against that reflective motivation. So understanding how behaviour acts in the moment is absolutely crucial, because we're not acting reflectively all the time. So we need, when we're trying to do behaviour change techniques and interventions, we need to try and address both of these things. So we need to try and make people reflectively believe, and we also need to try to curtail impulses or get people to act on good impulses. And why did I do that then? Yes, and that's the motivation part of it, but we do also need to tackle the capability part, which we do very well, and we also need to think about people's opportunity as well. Okay, so that was a whistle-stop tour to behaviour change theory. And now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we've been doing with in AMR. I am not an AMR expert. I am probably the least expert AMR person in this room right now, which, let me tell you, is quite a frightening position to be in. However, I'm going to tell you what we've been doing. So, the Commonwealth Pharmacists for Antimicrobial Stewardship project is a project funded by Department of Health and Social Care and the Fleming Fund, administered through the CPA and through THET to leverage the UK institutions' capacity to develop capacity in 4 Commonwealth countries to address the challenges of AMR. And these are the countries in which it's been working. There are 5 health partnerships in Ghana. So this is a relationship between a UK organisation and a Ghanaian organisation. There's 5 of them in Uganda, 1 in Tanzania and 1 in Zambia. And I run a project called the Change Exchange, and we work in health partnerships. We're a collective of behavioural scientists, psychologists. We work in health partnerships to try to leverage behavioural science, sort of translate behavioural science in situ to make that kind of partnership work more effective. Okay? So the kind of activities we engage ourselves in is we observe the activities that people are doing that they want to change practice. We evaluate what behaviours people are trying to change and what the influences on those behaviours might be. What we then do is we work with that partnership, we report back to them, and we talk to them about what behaviours they are explicitly targeting and how we make recommendations into how they could target those in a more appropriate way, which aligns with behaviour change evidence and theory. And across partnerships, we then analyse and this pool data, because often the partnerships are trying to change the same behaviours. And then we're also working at policy level to try to get more people engaged in using behavioural science in all elements of policy. And in order to do that, we've got lots of materials and stuff. The thing on the left there is a pack of cards that we made, each of which describes a behaviour change technique that you can use, and there are some games you can play to use the cards. We've got lots of e-learning modules that all of which kind of focus on how we translate those things about behaviour into what people are actually doing. Because it'd be very ironic if I knew that behaviour didn't change because you told people things, and then what I did was tell people to use behaviour change techniques, because that's kind of just not right. So what we try and do is use the behaviour change techniques that we know to engage with policymakers and practitioners in this sort of learning environment. So I'm just going to describe one of the partnerships in a little bit more detail, just to give you a bit of a flavour. So this was a partnership between the police hospital in Ghana, which is in the capital of Ghana, Accra. It's quite a busy hospital. It's quite well resourced. It's very bizarre because everyone's a policeman or woman, police officer, and even though they're also a pharmacist. And by that I mean they are actually genuinely a police officer. So they like one day peacekeeping in South Sudan, the next day dispensing medicine. It's like a sort of very bizarre setup. Apparently it's quite common, and military hospitals are similar as well. So that was Ghana Police Hospital. Keta Municipal Hospital is in a much more rural area, much more traditional, just ordinary hospital, but it's quite remote. And we were working, the health partnership there was between Health Improvement Scotland and the University of Strathclyde. So the way that these partnerships usually work is that there's a scoping visit, an intervention visit, and a follow-up visit. So in May 2019, we went with the team to Ghana and we did this scoping visit. And what we discovered was, even just within those 2 hospitals in one country, that there were really different influences on behaviour. In the police hospital, there was actually quite militaristic control over prescribing, well, over everything actually. So when we were interviewing prescribers, dispensers, about how they knew what to do and if something changed and if there were new guidelines brought in, and it was all through ordering. Basically, they received an order from a commanding officer and they did as they were told, which kind of made the whole behaviour change thing a bit redundant, which was interesting, but it's unusual. And in Keta, it was a much more typical picture where There were lots of different behaviours that needed to change in order to improve how antibiotics were being used. So some of these were about prescribers, looking at guidelines and following guidelines. Some of these were about pharmacy technicians being confident enough, or the confidence is the influence, of course, but addressing, checking that things were in line with guidelines, and then having a conversation with the prescriber. I'm sure all of this is makes a lot of sense to everybody in practice everywhere. And so what we were able to do by working with the teams is to define what the specific behaviours are, and then through a series of sort of interviews and observations, is to try to understand what the influences are on those behaviours. What that then does is it feeds back into how we intervene. So we know that the behaviours, for example, it was a big social opportunity issue that prescribers in Cater were not being challenged, were not allowing challenge, if you like, from pharmacists. So the intervention included some role-playing around those discussions, and it was multidisciplinary so that everybody was saying the same sort of thing. So the process there is that the behaviour is specified and that the influences on the behaviours are understood before the interventions are employed, and the interventions themselves are evidence-based or theory-based on what is likely to influence those kinds of behaviours. So they then all go back for their intervention visits, which are going on at the moment, and they will have a follow-up visit to see what's changed. And again, we can use behavioural science to understand what's changed, because we can not only measure behaviour, but we can also measure attitudes and that capability, opportunity, motivation stuff. Just a little bit of the pooled data from the scoping visits. This was across all the partnerships. So we looked at IPC behaviours, and we stratified them into capability, opportunity, motivation. So, for example, there were some capability issues. So some people weren't skilled in cleaning, and they didn't know what types of cleaning that they had to do, and they didn't understand how hand gel worked. Opportunity-wise, personal protective equipment was rarely available, running water wasn't available, the 2 staff were required for the standing water to work properly, and they weren't always there, and there were no prompts for IPC either. But people who were in the habit of good IPC behaviours were maintaining them. So there was something there about how we can generate good habits, because that seemed to be sustaining. In terms of prescriber behaviours, there was some overconfidence, so some people believing that they didn't need to look at the guidelines. Then there was some genuine concerns, genuine knowledge issues around whether the guidelines actually apply in those specific circumstances. Opportunity-wise, sometimes things were missing, the juniors can't challenge, as I was saying, and pressure from patients as well. And motivation was that this sort of balance between the desire to treat and the desire not to use the broad-spectrum antibiotics. And also a bit of habit as well about what people usually prescribed. And in terms of dispenser behaviours, they had a lack of information to challenge, they felt sometimes. They didn't have time. The prescribers, that social opportunity, the prescribers didn't accept challenge. There was a big issue around stocks in some of the countries. And then motivationally, some people said it wasn't their role. And then there was time. If you ask any health professional about any behaviour, they'll tell you it's time, every single time, largely because they're under a lot of time pressure, but also because time is actually a proxy for prioritisation. So people do find time to do things that are a top priority, and so we had to dig deep if people say time is an issue. None of the projects really looked at patient or public behaviours. It's probably out of scope of the project, actually, but people did comment about how they were very important. How many times anybody thought about their tally? Number 6 on the wine. Have you gone up?
It's slowing. I think I've only reached 10.
Oh, you've attenuated.
Yeah.
You've attenuated. Excellent. That's about our Maltesers person at the back. 7. Oh, yeah, good. Very good indeed. Okay, so The most important thing about the impulse and that particular part of what we've been talking about is that it's very easy to blame people who don't do things that we think they should do. And it's very easy to say people aren't prioritising it, they don't believe that it's important, they don't care about it. And what we know, what behavioural science tells us, and if you only take one thing away from what I'm talking to you about today, is that that's not actually the case. That people tend to know if they need behaviours to change, they tend to believe it, but it's very difficult in the moment to ignore our impulses. We have cues that we don't expect. Before Mr. Sauvignon, before the wine was put up, had you thought about wine yet this afternoon?
Do I have to answer that honestly?
Oh my God. Go on then.
A little bit.
A little bit. What about Maltesers person? Had you thought about Maltesers particularly? Not Maltesers. Maybe chocolate. Okay. So in the morning when I give this lecture to my medical students, they haven't usually thought about wine before they come into the lecture theatre. But the point is that sometimes we don't think about stuff at all until it's actually right in front of us. And we can harness that by prompting people to do things we want them to do. But we can also help people by removing prompts to do things that we don't want them to do. And we can talk to people about what we think is prompting them in that moment. Because really understanding how all of that reflective stuff interacts with the impulsive automatic stuff in the moment is the absolute key to trying to understand behaviour, and really takes us beyond the sort of cycle that we're in of training and blaming. Okay, that's it.